Hi, everybody. I'm Santita Jackson here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you today and for you who are all around the country and all around the world joining us. I'm so glad that you're with us today on D Day. On D Day. Boy, everything was really concluding in the Second World War when all of these troops landed on the coastline of Normandy in France. And what does it mean? What does it mean as these troops were trying to end this war and get home? And they wanted peace. It's so interesting. We don't talk about the fact that many soldiers, when they come home, they want peace. Those who've been in combat. That's what I heard from my grandfather, who was in combat, both of them in the Second World War. Last time I saw my grandfather, Charles Henry Jackson, last time I saw him alive, he said to me, shared with me some painful experiences that he had in the military. Arriving in New York, riding the train south, having to move in Washington, D.C. to the colored car so that the Nazi POWs could take his seat in the main car, having to cut grass for Nazi POWs as a job when he got back to the United States. And on and on and on and on it went. Many people call for peace. And where's the peace dividend? Where's the peace dividend? Indeed, Mother's Day was originally Mother's Day for peace.
That's right.
Because
Where you
after
were
the
now.
carnage of the Civil War, mothers on both sides, Confederate and Union mothers, were taking care of children who were on different sides of the political spectrum. They said, I hope that if my child is behind that enemy line, some mother will take pity on my child, will love them and care for them. Think about that, everybody. But what does this mean? And I think D Day means something different in 2024 than it did in 1944. And I have these veterans here and this brilliant scholar who can help us to, and this brilliant lawyer who can help us to ferret through all of that. I mean, what does D Day mean today as more and more of our police are militarized? They're trained. Many American police are trained in Israel and they come back with combat tactics and then they roll tanks down our streets and on and on and on. What does D Day mean today? In the second hour, we're going to talk about the Trump Biden push for the black vote. Who the thunk it, everybody? That is what you're seeing all over the place. Oh, you can go on and laugh once away. I mean, I think it's a great thing. It's a great thing when you're pursued. But what is going on? And do we have the questions that we need to ask? Are we making the right demands of everybody? Of everybody. And those who are in the Democratic and Republican camps, are you fighting for the interests of the people? That's all I want to know. So let's talk about that. Are the polls misleading or are they telling a truth that makes some people uncomfortable today? So let's talk about D Day and what it means today. 80 years later, we've got Windsor Wade, veteran. Thank you for your service, and I thank all of you for your service. And not just military service, teachers, garbage workers, anyone who makes our society work. I thank all of you. But I thank you in a special day today. We've seen wall to wall coverage of D Day, and we want to find out your thoughts because you and Mike Ferner are from Veterans for Peace. Something that you saw that made you come home as freedom fighters for peace. And then we've got Devin Vilfrard from FAMU, and of course, for the National Guard, serving his community right on the ground. Whenever we've had disasters, you are one of the persons that we see, and we thank you for that. We've got the esteemed Professor John Quigley from The Ohio State University, brilliant, brilliant international uh, law expert. Want to know about the conventions of war? Are we watching Are we watching war crimes? And how do we feel about that today?
Yeah, we are.
Okay, Windsor Wade, I can't wait to hear from you. And Mark Fancher, Attorney Mark Fancher, brilliant, brilliant civil libertarian from the National Conference of Black Lawyers. So, let's get things kicked off. I mean, Windsor Wade, Mr. Wade, you, Mr. Army, you got things kicked off because you gave me an amen like we were in church. So, talk to me. What does D Day mean to you today?
Well, first of all, you can see the shirt that I'm wearing. Peace
Yes.
Walk 2024, sponsored by Veterans for Peace. Um, we started May 8th. I walked for 2 weeks to New Haven, Connecticut, and came home for rest and relaxation, got a little ill, and I plan on returning the walk on the 20th to finish July 5th in Washington, D.C.
Hmm.
And I was compelled to participate in this because last October I returned to Vietnam with a delegation of mostly service people to Vietnam for 2 weeks. I got drafted when I was 20 years old. Spent a tour in Vietnam with an elite combat unit called the 173rd Airborne Brigade. I'm a retired history teacher, taught global history, AP World History for some 30 odd years. So in public school, retired about 5 or 6 years ago. And so this whole issue about D-Day and World War II and the fight against Nazism is something I know really well because I taught high school students. And I'm very well versed in the implications of how the world came to um, understand the danger of Nazism and form this incredible armada to confront and challenge and defeated Hitler and Nazism. But what it means to me, D-Day today, it was a time period in which the world saw an omniscient danger that threatened democracies around the world. Now we're here in 2024. Um, I really take my hat off to that generation that saved the world from darkness and Nazism. But since then, our country has been involved in wars that have not been something that the world need. We didn't come to save the world. Vietnam, here I am. You know, I understood it quite well before I went. I'd gone to several funerals of people that I'd grown up with who had been killed there. And so I was conscripted. I went to do something that my heart wasn't into. I knew it was morally wrong.
Hmm.
And since then, the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, um, and now Gaza that we are sponsoring. There's American soldiers not there, but all the weaponry has been funded by the United States. And so um, D-Day is a really important event in history, but we have a legacy of militarism and the money that we spend on foreign wars that could be better spent domestically, lifting the lives of people in this country.
Well,
Um,
Winter, wait, let me ask you this.
yes, ma'am.
You just stirred something in me because, of course, you were of a period where you saw the heavyweight champion of the world lose his, I mean, really lose his top earning power at the height of his physical powers. And he uh, decided not to go to the war. And
Yes.
other people did go, but people were like you. Did you see other people like you who felt
Oh,
conflicted or who felt that this is not right?
oh, absolutely. Um, by 1970, 71, Tet had happened, and that statement by Westmoreland, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. All of us out in the boonies knew there was no light at the end of the tunnel. Um, we were being, we could see through the lie. The morale was no one wanted to be KIA or wounded. No one wanted to win medals. No one wanted to be a John Wayne. You just want to do your time and go home in one piece. We had seen through the deception. Daniel Ellsberg had revealed through the Pentagon Papers that America was being lied to from day one. And many of us, most of us graduated from high school, many of us had gone to college. So we saw in the 60s the deception and the lies. And so most of us in my unit, we had each other's backs. Black, white, Hispanic, we were brothers in arms. We just wanted to do our duty, serve honorably, and go home.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, Mike Ferner,
back to our loved ones, back to our families, our brothers
alive.
and sisters, our girlfriends, our wives. We're all young, 20, 21 years of age. Most of us hadn't been married. We had girlfriends back home, got that Dear John letter. I love you, but you're a long way from home. I hope to see you when you get back. How can we stay friends? All that kind of stuff. But yeah, it was, if any of you have not been to Washington, D.C., to see the Vietnam Memorial, you should take your time to go see that. I think that is the most remarkable tribute that does not glorify war. Black granite with the names by the year of the men and women who gave their lives. I went to the dedication. There are names up there. Excuse me.
Don't take your time.
I'll have to see it just one time. Just one time. It's so powerful. It should be the memorial that should end all the wars that our country participated in, but it has not done that. We've had Iraq, we have Afghanistan, and unfortunately, I think too many Americans are under the deception that our unequivocal support of Israel is something we should do, and it's a false premise. There are war crimes happening in Gaza, and the Palestinian people have been done a great, not this whole thing about Hamas on the October 7th, that was an horrific act, but you need to understand the history of the occupation of the Palestinian people, the Nakba, what it did to them. It's a very deep story that I think most people in the public don't understand. It's not taught in schools. I taught it. I taught it at a very progressive high school in which I was able to, and my vision, my understanding, what the truth was and what the deceptions were. And I was able to impart that and give my students the facts that as I saw them, to make up their minds for themselves about what they believed was the legacy of our country in war, and how it's something, war only begets revenge. Dr. King said, of all the endeavors of humankind, war is the madness of them all.
Absolutely. I mean, my grandfather told me the last time I saw him, I shared this with you, Mike Ferner. The last time I saw him alive, he told me about the horrors of the Second World War. Black soldiers being sent into the concentration camps to rescue those who survived.
Yes.
But they were sent there because there were landmines. They were sent there because the survivors knew that they were not Nazis, but principally because they would get blown up first.
Mm-hmm.
And then having to, arriving home in New York and taking the train because he was from South Carolina. And when they got to the nation's capital, he had to move to the colored car.
Mm-hmm.
And then they moved the Nazi POWs to the main car. And this is when Black folks were fighting double V, victory at home and victory abroad. It
went to Europe to fight Nazism, came back home, had to fight Jim Crow.
Wait a minute, which they learned, and Nazis learned how to do what they did by studying Jim Crow.
Came to study Jim Crow in the United States.
But even the Nazi POWs, when they came here, there's a wonderful book, Hitler's American Model. They said, we don't even treat Jewish people this way. Right. When they went south and saw how Black people were being treated. It's just a lot. Mike Ferner, D-Day, and what it means to you today. And I'm mindful, Mr. Wade, of your tears. Because I don't think that anyone walks away from war, Mike Ferner, unscathed. It just, there's so much pain there.
And it stays with you. It doesn't ever go away. It diminishes, but memories and it takes a conversation or reading of a book, and those feelings that you thought had been dispelled, they'll well up in you. Once you've seen the face of war, you'll never forget it. It never leaves you.
Mike Ferner?
Well, he's absolutely right. Nobody that goes through that ever comes back unchanged. Um, anybody, anybody that goes through the military, even if you aren't in combat, comes back home unchanged. Um, but Windsor mentioned about the what's going on in Palestine and in Gaza right now, as the history not starting on October 7th, and the history didn't start on D-Day, and it didn't start on December 7th when Pearl Harbor was bombed. You can go back to exactly what you were talking about, Santita, with the Hitler's model, the American model. He found in the United States a number of things with Jim Crow and etc. I mean, he even talked about how the United States took care of the, quote, Redskins, and that was going to be their model for the Jews. But you go back to the fact that American corporations supplied the technical knowledge, provided the money. I mean, Hitler's brown shirts were a bunch of street thugs before Henry Ford and the people at General Electric and some of these other companies started funding the Nazi Party 10 years before they came to power, because they had similar goals and similar ideals. And, American corporations, law firms, oil companies, I mean, all down the line, were involved with them up into and sometimes even during the entire war. So, for people who say that, World War II saved the world for democracy and we were fighting a valiant effort and a noble cause, you can't start history on that day when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. You got to go back and find out how the conditions were created that led to that war. And we've got to go back to how are the conditions created for Hamas to want to break out of that open air prison. It's like here we are over in the empire, and we are creating these conditions. It's like we're running a scientific experiment with rats. See how much stress you can put on a group of rats, how much you can cut back on their food. All these different stresses. How much do you do that before things just blow up? And then you stand back and say, "Oh, aren't they terrible?" No, well, we committed in this country. We created the conditions for that. So every one of us has got some responsibility for what's going on, and for us to say, we're fighting for freedom and democracy, that's the standard line we get all the time. So yeah, D-Day, yeah, you can say if you want to start history right around then, or you want to start history when the Second World War started, maybe you can say that was a necessary thing. But I agree with Howard Zinn when he says that there is no glory in war and nothing good ever comes out of it. Because once you create those conditions, things just spin out of control. People come back with evil in their heads and their hearts, and things happen back home that should never have happened. It just goes on and on. So, that's, I've gotten back to this same thing a couple of times on your show, Santita. And one of the things you mentioned Eisenhower earlier when we were talking on the phone. And, one of the things he talked about was the impact on government. He says we must never let the weight of this combination, meaning the military-industrial complex, endanger our liberties or democratic processes. And that's exactly what it has done. It has not just endangered them, it has taken them over. So I'll just leave it at that.
And he was really he forewarned us
Yeah.
that if we didn't push back against this military industrial complex, that we would end up
Yeah.
really where we are now.
Yeah.
Devin, Wilfred. Well, no, Mr. Wade, before Devin. Mr. Wade, you were going to say something else?
And I was just concurring with what Mike said. You know, the history of the militarism of our country lays the foundations for the next war, and the next war, and the next war. Unfortunately, and it's so integrated into our economy, the production of weapons, weapon systems, and you know, we've not been able to wean ourselves off that relationship, and it's so highly integrated into our economy. I think most people don't see it; it's invisible unless you really want to investigate it.
One of the mantras of Veterans for Peace, Windsor, is peace at home and peace abroad. Because we don't have peace abroad, and you have the weapons industry doing what they do, we don't have peace at home.
Exactly.
We don't have peace at home because there is such gross inequity, and that inequity derives in large part from the fact that our citizens seem to feel it's okay to spend half of our national treasure on weapons and death.
Military, yeah,
it's crazy.
Well, you know what, which brings me to you, Devin, because you're from another generation. You don't even, Vietnam is in the history books, and so is Iraq for that matter. I mean, and these are things, I've never known America not to be at war. And when I was a little girl, people were beginning to come home when I was a little girl. And you're in the National Guard. It appears that you are. Do you have a different view of the military? I mean, how do you, when we have these national military holidays and international ones? I mean, what is your thinking?
Before I answer, I do have to say my lift will probably be here in a couple of minutes. So if you see me come off screen and switch to my phone, that's why. But my way of thinking when it comes to the military and my experience in the military is confliction. So the reason why I say that is because I was happy to serve the state of Florida and of course the country in times of need when it comes to like hurricane recovery within the National Guard. And of course, you know, the once in a generation pandemic, I was on active duty for a year and a half, helping with that, whether it be testing people or at the operations center in Tallahassee, Florida, to help, you know, facilitate missions and things like that through the hurricane recovery. So I'm proud and honored to have helped my state and my country during, you know, those times of need, whether it be the hurricanes or the pandemic. But at the same time, I'm not proud of the racism I endured while in the military. I'm not proud of the military industrial complex. That stuff I can't really vouch for, especially, you know, just hearing certain things, seeing certain things, especially while, you know, Trump was in office. I know. So I'll say this: I had a unique experience of serving under 3 presidents in a span of 6 years. So the first 2 years was under President Obama, 4 years under President Trump, and then the last 2 years under President Biden. And I remember before President Obama finished his term, at my unit, they took down his picture in the chain of command, where they, you know, usually, of course, you all, as veterans know, there's pictures of your sergeant, your first sergeant, excuse me, your captain, and all the way up to the president. And they took down President Obama's picture. And that was before he had left office. So he was still serving within his capacity as president, and they took it down. I served in Marietta, Florida, Deep South. So I wasn't as surprised. I was surprised to see it, but not surprised by who did it. So I'll say that. Another thing I'll share before I switch is that when I first joined the military, did basic training and things like that, it didn't hit me until I went to basic training and I seen that the clothing they gave us was wrapped in packages that said "Prison Industries of the United States," and it made me uncomfortable knowing that I'm a black man, of course, and I'm thinking I'm doing something amazing for our country, but then I see that I'm getting clothes that reads as "Prison Industries of the United States," and it hit me that these clothes were made by people within the prison system. And of course, as someone who is a NAACP Life member, awarded social justice activist, and of course a veteran, that didn't escape my mind when I went to basic training. And I don't say all this to be super negative about the military. I think there's positive things that the military can do for people, especially people in low income communities. But I do feel conflicted when I do experience negative situations, especially in terms of my race. And I hear people say things or do things or support certain people, especially as the military is supposed to be, of course, a nonpartisan entity. But I still see and experience other military members advocating for things that would not necessarily be beneficial for the Black community and other people of color. So that's why I say it's confliction, but I'm not completely, I guess, dissuaded from my service because I was able to have awards based in humanitarianism. Because I am a humanitarian at heart. I was never in combat, but I still made sure to do the right thing while I was in service. So I will say that, and then I'm gonna switch to my phone. So if you don't see me on camera, I'm still here. Just
No,
on my phone.
we're gonna. I mean, and that brings me to you, Attorney Fancher. I know you can't stay with us the whole time, but and Mr. Wade and Mr. Ferner and Professor Quigley, it brings me to you, Mark, because the only way that you serve cannot be in combat. I mean, I think he was of service, but I mean, but you see, you can clearly hear someone who's in conflict. Because I mean, of course, that prison industries who make the uniforms, that is a government-run program. And of course, anyone who has some cursory read of the Constitution, I'm here with a lawyer and a legal scholar. Yeah, we were freed from slavery, unless we go to prison. So, I mean, what your thoughts about this? And I'm going to ask everyone to put on mute because we're getting some feedback, and I don't know what that is. So, everyone, you mute yourselves, except Mark Fancher.
All right. Yeah. Well, I think that it's helpful to look at the very nature of how empires operate, and when you do, you understand that what it's all about is a small group of people who have lots of power and wealth, and their desire to make everybody who doesn't have those things do their dirty work for them. So in the earliest phases of it, as it began in North America, you had people who needed people to do their dirty work in terms of agricultural work. So you enslave a lot of people and you make them do it. And then when those enslaved people are rebellious and they're standing up, then you need somebody to go out and fight them and to watch over them. So you recruit powerless white people who are very poor to serve that function, so that they serve as overseers on the plantation. They serve as slave catchers, and they serve in other capacities that are intended to do the dirty work that will preserve the comfort and the wealth of those who are elite and who are powerful. And then when you have indigenous peoples who don't like the idea of this elite group trying to establish an empire in North America, and they resist and they fight back, then you need to recruit more powerless white people who are very poor to go into military service and to serve as part of the cavalry to go out and fight indigenous peoples. And so as these elite forces began to look beyond the national borders and they began to establish global empires, then you need an even larger military force. And certainly these people are not going to get their hands dirty. They're not going to go out there and risk their lives to put down the resistance to their efforts to control other lands. And so you have to have more powerless, poor people of all colors to serve as soldiers. who will go out and who will protect the interests of the powerful. And so when we get to World War II, what we're looking at really is a situation where, contrary to the popular narrative of the Western countries rising to the task of trying to defend democracy and defend freedom, what you actually have are Western empires that see their control of the world slipping because of this Nazism that's taking root, and their need to put that down and to control and preserve their ability to maintain empires. And so it's all about that. I mean, it's conceivable that if their empires were not threatened by it, that they would have been happy to sit back and allow genocide to take place of the Jewish people in Germany, because that's what they do. We've seen it happen in other places where, when it's irrelevant to their continuing dominance of the planet, then they're glad to sit back and allow genocide to happen. In fact, sometimes, as in Gaza, they're happy to participate in the genocide if that means that they're going to be able to preserve the power of their empire and their dominance that they have of the planet. And the great tragedy of it is that it takes good people, like the brothers here, and other, very concerned young men and women who do want to provide good service to their fellow human beings. And they draw them in with all kinds of mythology and all kinds of stories about how they're fighting people who are trying to impose dictatorship, or they're trying to bring communism, or in the most recent eras, they're trying to impose terrorism on the planet, and that they're doing a good thing by doing this, when in fact what they're doing is they're engaging in the dirty work that the imperialists themselves don't want to do. So I think that the great danger from the perspective of the imperialists is that those who are soldiers or prospective soldiers will become clear in their thinking and will begin to understand the role that they're playing, and that they won't play that role. And I always give credit to the Black community in particular for ending the war in Iraq, because what they found through studies that were conducted by the Army is that they were unable to recruit sufficient numbers of soldiers from the Black community to fight that war, because people who were influential in the Black community, teachers and pastors and coaches and others, said, "Do not enlist in the Army to go fight this imperialist war," and the numbers plummeted, and so they didn't have enough people to fight that war, and so they necessarily had to bring it to an end, which I think is instructive, because it helps us to understand how we fight against the military-industrial complex. We just don't participate in it, and it's as simple as that. And one of my favorite stories is one that I heard on the radio of a young Black man who had told his mother that he was going to enlist in the Army during the Iraq War, and his mother told him, "You want to enlist in the Army so that you can go and get yourself shot and killed, for nothing?" He said, "If you want to get yourself shot and killed, enlist in the Army and I'll shoot you." So we have to understand the power of non-collaboration, non-cooperation with the empire and with the military-industrial complex. And the final thing I'll say is this: that war is in itself a contradiction. Dialectics says that there are positive aspects in everything, no matter how evil they may seem. And one of the few positive things about Nazism, and certainly Nazism overall is not positive because the negative outweighs it by far. But one of the positive things about it is that because of the crisis that it caused in Europe, it demanded that European countries, the Western countries, redirect much of the energy and the resources that they had been using to control their colonies in Africa primarily to the war effort. And they have looked at this and they found that the fact that the attention was diverted away from the colonies in Africa gave Africa the opportunity to begin to organize. And it set in motion that period when decolonization became very successful, through the late 1940s into the 1950s and on into the 60s and the 70s. And
Hmm.
so that whenever imperialists do engage in war, then one of our tasks is to find one of the unintended consequences of it from their perspective, to find out the ways in which their engagement in war is somehow making them vulnerable. And then once we identify that vulnerability, to attack it without mercy. And I think that the experience that we're seeing in Palestine right now is an excellent example of it. There's so many vulnerabilities that have been exposed as a
Hmm.
result of what's happening there. And I think that fortunately, there are a lot of very conscious people who are seizing the opportunity and who are pressing it and who are raising the contradictions to a point where everybody can see it. And it has placed the empire in a real crisis, and it is verging on collapse.
And Mark, before you go, because I think that people now separate the soldiers from the war. There was a lot of conflating of that when we were, I mean, during the Vietnam War. So many of the soldiers came back and they felt, I mean, they were treated contemptuously, and people were angry about the war. But now people say, wait, there's a poverty draft, y'all. A lot of folks are trying to get out from under, and this is how they get into college. This is how I mean, a lot of people, their backs were against the wall.
Oh, absolutely. We can never blame the soldiers for the sins and the crimes of the empire. They are as much the victims of imperialism as any of us. They've been manipulated and exploited and used for bad purposes. They've been induced into service many times under false pretenses and lies. The great tragedy of it is that so many of them have such good intentions. They are persuaded that there is a great existential crisis that's confronting the world, and they're being given a golden opportunity to go and to meet that crisis, to sacrifice themselves, to throw their bodies into harm's way, so that they can protect their fellow human beings. And unfortunately and tragically, that's not always the mission that they've been given. Their mission, unfortunately, is very often to protect the wealth of large corporations, and to the influence and the dominance of certain imperial governments. And it compounds the tragedy of the death and the destruction that comes out of war generally.
Attorney Mark Fancher, National Conference of Black Lawyers, I thank you so much for sharing this time with us today, because I think we need to reflect on war. I mean, Mother's Day was Mother's Day for Peace. Elizabeth Ward Howe, who wrote the lyrics to the Battle Hymn of the Republic, said, no, 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 no. The carnage, it has to stop. I mean, this is what people walk out of war doing, Professor Quickly. Um, and yet we continue on and on and on. And now,
Yeah.
you would think 80 years later, Professor Quickly and panel, we're America sponsoring a genocide.
Hmm. Yeah.
Professor Quigley, how do you reconcile D-Day? And we're honoring the last few survivors. Many of them
Yeah.
might not make it to the 90th anniversary. I mean,
100 years ago.
war crimes that are being committed with our money and ostensibly in our name. I mean, Professor John Quigley, what do you make of this? Okay, all you have to do is unmute. It's okay. The most brilliant thoughts. There you go.
I'm not brilliant enough to know to unmute, but what the others have been saying is that there's a disconnect between what the people who are fighting on the ground are experiencing, and the reasons that they are there. And I think, Windsor Wade kind of figured that out in the hard way in Southeast Asia,
Yep.
along with many of his comrades at the time who figured out that they were not engaging in the noble cause that they had been told they were engaging in. But at the basic level, I think the soldiers are mainly thinking about how to get themselves home without being killed.
Mhm.
I mean, I think, am I the only one on the panel who was alive during the Second World War? I may be.
I think
But
I think so.
Yeah.
And therefore you are offering a perspective that we really do need. We do.
yeah, I don't know that helps me understand. I just, remember from my parents and uncles and aunts talking about war that they just regarded it as something that happens every once in a while. And it's a negative thing, and you just have to go through it. Many of my parents were German immigrants. They when they thought of war, they thought of the Franco-German War, 1870. Then the First World War, and the young people had gone to fight, and then so that was even before the Second World War. But and I think now, especially the media coverage of D-Day tends to put it into these terms of world significance, and the people who were actually involved, were not thinking about world significance. They were thinking about why it is that they got into the war when some of their friends were lucky enough not to be in the war. I mean, they weren't really looking to go, to fight for democracy. That has come to be the dominant media take on it. I think more recently, although that certainly was involved. But there was also the way that we fought the war. I mean, after D-Day, we went in and bombed Germany in ways that would now qualify as war crimes. When we tried the Germans in Nuremberg, we did not charge them with bombing of civilian territory, which could easily have been done for the Blitz, for the bombing of London, the bombing of Coventry in England. But in the prosecution documents that were drawn up, there is none of that. And the reason it was left out was that the Allies did the same thing, especially in Dresden, which the bombing that and I guess in Vietnam it came to be called carpet bombing.
Right.
I think that hadn't been invented yet in the Second World War, but it was intentional bombing of civilian areas in order to convince the German government to stop the war. I mean, the same thing we did in Tokyo, the firebombing of Tokyo, which was some of my relatives were involved in, I can say. That was also done to convince the Japanese government to stop fighting, and the technique was to kill civilians.
Yeah.
So when you want to look at the history of the Second World War, I think on D-Day the media does it a bit selectively. One can understand that. One can understand the feelings of the guys who are now 100 years old who are going back there to commemorate. But that's not the whole story. But
Right.
one I think that after we've been involved in these things, as I think Windsor Wade was saying and Mike Ferner, that you would think we would figure out that it really doesn't achieve anything in the long run to get involved in a war, and unless your back is against the wall, you're really being attacked. Okay, but the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, um, were both disasters from the standpoint of the United States. We didn't achieve anything positive for the United States in either one, and we just made bad situations worse by engaging in those wars. Um, and so when we, said rah rah when Israel went into Gaza, it was the same thing all over again. Why are we promoting a war that is obviously going to have more negative than positive effects? And maybe it's because we don't sufficiently inculcate the lessons of the prior wars. We want to say that the people who actually went and fought did something good, did something noble, and as Mark Fancher was saying, you don't want to lay the blame on those people. And I think that makes it hard to develop a narrative that the prior wars were as negative as they were in a big picture sense. So we keep thinking, well, when the situation arises, we have an option to go into war or not. We don't think about the prior wars.
I only have a few minutes left, but I tell you what, I want you all to come back so that we can talk about this, because there is another discussion that needs to be had. There's another discussion that needs to be had when I hear you have to catch yourself, Windsor Wade, some 50 years later, because of the pain. No one wants to talk about that, Mike Ferner. No, I've just seen a few people come back more, and they're different people. You're not the same. And what did Eisenhower say? He said this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. That this 60 years ago, the total influence, economic, political, and even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. I thought it was interesting that he would bring in the spiritual, because it does reshape who you are. So, Devin, I've got about a minute for you, young man, because
Yes, ma'am.
you said, NAACP lifetime member,
Yes,
serving
ma'am.
during the pandemic. Serve, serve, serve. But I have some problems here. What is your takeaway from D-Day
Mm-hmm.
and even Memorial Day, which was started by enslaved people because these people took a side. They dumped these white Union soldiers without honor in a grave, and Black people said no. We're going to give them proper burials.
That's right.
Well,
Yeah.
for me, for Memorial Day, D-Day, things that celebrate the work and service of veterans. No matter your color, your skin, or where you're from, I respect it, because it takes you having to sign, your name on that contract, and even if you were drafted in, that's even less of your decision, but you still did the work, so I respect it. And I remember, the sacrifice that they gave. And, I just try to be as honorable to them and their service as much as possible, especially, veterans of color. Where I know it was, like you all said earlier, it was two fights that they had to fight. War over there and then war back home. So even though, I'm young, I'm only 26, I try and make sure I serve in their honor as best as possible and I respect them as much as possible. Even if for the veterans I've met who were World War II veterans. I just try to make sure I give them as much respect as possible.
Bless your heart.
Could
Winter
I make a
Wade,
comment?
you want that?
Um, as Devin was saying, as a man of color, there's a lot of conflict to be called to service by a country. Like I said earlier, when I was drafted in 1970, I knew in my heart that what our country was doing in Vietnam was immoral. It was racist. It was militaristic. And I remember before I went inducted, I got inducted in Buffalo, and I could look across the bridge and see Canada. And I called my parents. What do I do? I could walk across that bridge and avoid all of this. And my folks they said they didn't try to browbeat me. They said, you do what's in your heart, what you think is right. So I thought about what Dr. King said about the war. Ali said, why should a black man be called by a white man to go kill a yellow man halfway around the world? All that stuff was whirling around in my head. And so I served, and I wanted to serve it honorably. I did not want to dishonor the uniform. I didn't want to dishonor my family's name. And it was a very difficult thing to do because I was doing something that I knew, and I was raised in the church. Thou shalt not kill. And the whole time, you're trained to kill. That was your mission, to kill the enemy. And 50 years later, you got to live with that. You have to live with that.
The moral.
That's why it doesn't leave you.
Yeah. Matthew Hope
as
talks
a man
about
of color, as a man of,
no, please.
Someone who was raised in a way to honor human life, and I became a very political person at a very young age. I knew what I was doing was wrong. And for so many people, regardless of your race, black, white, I think people around me, we knew what we were doing there was immoral. And that's why it's so hard. I'm 75 years old.
That's why some people say when veterans get thanked for their service, they say, I didn't serve, I was used.
Thank you.
And that's about the extent of it.
Excuse me for my emotion.
No. I have to tell you, I want to thank you for your emotion because you're showing us what people really go through. This is what I saw with my grandfather the last time I saw him. And I was going to leave my grandparents' bedroom with my Uncle Saint and my father there, my grandmother, my grandfather, because I thought they were about to talk grown folks business. I was 15. And he said, no, baby, stay. And then he told me about getting to New York and having the POWs come, Nazi POWs come before him, about his black friends getting blown up. He talked about being on the front line and black soldiers dying first. And he just went through that. And he said that to me. So I guess so that I could say that to you some 45 years later when I was a little girl. I'll never forget that as long as I live. And I'll never forget this with you, Mr. Wade, and you, Mike Ferner, because I think this is why you fight, Mike Ferner. I think this is why you fight, Windsor Wade. I think this is why you've taken the principal position in law that you've taken, John Quigley. And Devin, I think that is why you're doing what you're doing. But I think that we need to tell the stories of our soldiers because this is part of your story. There's a lot of pain behind a glory, always. There's always a story. But I want to thank you. I want to thank you for really loving us enough to be vulnerable to us and sharing your story. I want to thank you for that because you're going to help somebody today. And maybe one day we will truly thank people for teaching for being mothers, for being fathers, for being caregivers, for being, that's how we all serve. We can't continue to just pervert the term service so that it's only when you have to unlearn what did Elizabeth Wardhouse say, the charities that I've raised my child to have. I'm teaching you. You've taught them to kill. You make me. You want me to. You want my child to unlearn everything I taught him, her,
Right.
and that's what I'm hearing from you. And we've got to have that discussion. I think if we have that discussion, we can change the world. I
No
really
more
do.
war.
No more war. And then thank you, everybody. And may you have a blessed D-Day. And I hope that we think much more deeply about peace,
Amen.
which is not quiet. It's the presence of justice and the absence of killing people. Thou shalt not kill. Every faith says that, and there are no atheists on death row. So I'm sending you all so much love. Coming up, let's talk about the Biden-Trump fight for the black vote. I'm here for it, everybody. That's right. I'm sending you all so much love today.